This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. President-elect Joe Biden has pledged to get most of the nation's schools reopened in his first 100 days in office. That would be around April 30th. His choice of education secretary will play a big role in that initiative. Biden has named Connecticut's Education Commissioner Miguel Cardona as his pick for the cabinet seat. That's a choice that will require Senate confirmation. Joining us today are two reporters who have been covering Cardona in the Nutmeg State. Jacqueline Rabe Thomas, a longtime beat reporter with the Connecticut Mirror, is here. Jacqueline, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
We are also joined by Adria Watson, who covers education as a Report for America Fellow with the Connecticut Mirror. Adria, we're very glad you can be here as well.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Jacqueline, I do want to start with you. If people go online and they look up Miguel Cardona's CV, what are they going to see?
So Miguel has a long history in Meriden, Connecticut. Meriden is located roughly halfway between Hartford and New Haven. And it's a small city that is known in Connecticut as Silver City for its history of production of things like cutlery and other silver products. But he really has a history in the school system there. He was born in a housing project. He grew up in the school system. He started kindergarten as an English language learner. He's really into the school system there and really appreciates the neighborhood schools and has really focused much of his tenure in education on improving the education in that system. He also went to trade school in Meriden to be in automotive training, but he also has a really strong background and interest in music education as well. He's a bongo player himself. He considered becoming a music teacher when he was the first in his family to go off to college. And, after graduating college, he spent the first 5 years of his career teaching in an elementary school in Meriden. Meriden has changed a lot over the years. It's about 60% white and 40% Black and Hispanic. And that's really sort of shaped his philosophy of sort of how to go about improving neighborhood schools as far as who the actual students are. And he went on from becoming a teacher to becoming a principal in the school district for 10 years. And then shortly after that, after those 10 years were up, he became a performance evaluation specialist, essentially being the point person in the district for implementing these controversial teacher evaluation that were being required upon districts in Connecticut and on teachers throughout the state.
It's pretty fascinating because in terms of that CV, it'd be hard to find a candidate for this position who's more opposite the end of the spectrum from Betsy DeVos, who served under President Trump. We should point out that Betsy DeVos submitted her resignation January 8th in response to the pro-Trump mob who stormed the Capitol earlier in that same week. Jacqueline, if he is confirmed, Cardona would be the second person in this position who is of Puerto Rican descent following John B. King. And he also follows John B. King in that he is the second person who will have been a school principal. And it sounds like both of those factors really shaped who Cardona is.
Yeah, so his parents moved here from Puerto Rico. And his family does the Puerto Rican festival every year. I think he was the vice chair one year, Miguel Cardona was. And he really sees the various cultures in his community as an asset and not something to sort of lose it and forget it and move on to English as soon as possible. When you hear him speak, he regularly brings in his language. He's proud of his language, as he should be. And he makes sure to make students who come from similar backgrounds as him to embrace that and feel that it's something special.
Adria, I want to ask you, what has Cardona shown or said will be his top priorities when it comes to education policies? I mean, tell us what he's thinking about in terms of having a role in reopening some of the nation's schools.
Yes. So school openings have been left up to local districts. Miguel Cardona has encouraged them to stay open for as long as they can, but has said that he feels like districts leaders know their community best and 100% supports it continuing to be left locally. There have been people who think he and the department should have stronger guidelines and mandates for districts, like schools needing to reopen in-person learning for young students, low-income and homeless students, and students with disabilities, since they are groups to lose out more on learning remotely. But he said before and said multiple times throughout the school year that he thinks that these communities and the district leaders know their communities best, and that he sees his job as a way to provide state level guidance and be responsive to needs.
It sounds like when Cardona called closing the school as a, quote, educational emergency, he sees this as much about learning loss as it is about things like the health and safety of kids when they're not in school.
Yeah. So one of the things that, he's talked about is that they feel like they have a better handle on how to track what's going on with where kids are, and like that they're following safety precautions when they're in school, because the schools right now, the state has mandates for them to wear masks. They have mandates for, the classrooms to be socially distanced. So he said himself too, like they're able to keep an eye out on kids when they're in schools and feel like that is a better option for them right now, rather than, them being at home and learning from home, where they may have the urge to go out and go into the communities or be around people.
He called it an educational emergency very much because he saw what was going to happen to these students and their parents if schools were not open, as well as the amount of learning loss. And so he was very laser focused on tracking to sort of prove that that is in fact what's happening. So for anyone who was not convinced that students were worse off being at home, he set up a immediate campaign and data network to show just how much students are missing school. The data system that he set up shows that homeless students went from missing 11% of school days to now missing 21% of school days. The same data system showed that in the spring, 1 out of every 4 students just didn't log on at all, period. Not at all. Didn't log on for those 3 months that schools were shut down in the spring. They didn't show up once. Students went missing in Connecticut. And as the school year approached this year, he made sure that wasn't going to happen again without a public acknowledgement of this is the scope of the problem. Here is the public emergency that's happening in Connecticut. And for homeless students, that was, a lot of students who are missing twice as many days. It's across the spectrum when you talk about special ed kids missing more days, English learners missing incredibly more days. It's vulnerable group after vulnerable group after vulnerable group are just not logging on as much as they were previously. And then after showing that data, he showed, okay, kids who were in school versus out of school and at home remotely, how often were they missing school? So is this a matter of if they're home not missing school, or is it people aren't feeling safe when they're coming to school? So he also broke it out by the type of learning model. So he very much is a data-based person to sort of rally support around a crisis that he felt was going on.
That's really fascinating. And you talked about, people who may have not felt safe sending their kids back to school. Adria, what about the teachers?
So the teachers at the beginning of the school year in the teachers union, they have voiced their concerns and voiced that they, weren't really comfortable with having the schools reopen back at the end of August and early September. At the beginning of the school year, the state's largest teachers unions called for the state to close the districts for about 3 weeks until, they feel like buildings were up to par and that safety standards were met. And they were saying that they just didn't feel comfortable and felt like schools were essentially like ready to open. And over the last few months, we've seen the unions and the teachers continue to voice that concern and feel that their safety is being put at risk with schools being open. 4 or 5 months after they were asking for the state to close schools for a few weeks at the beginning of the school year, they still continued to ask the state if they could close, coming back from the holidays and the winter break. And a lot of what the teachers and the teachers unions wanted to see from Cardona and the state was for them to come in and mandate that, the schools close for a certain amount of time until they can get kids tested and figure out where to take the safety precautions.
It's tough for us not to look at things right now through this coronavirus pandemic lens of everything being focused on that. But clearly, he has educational priorities beyond the school reopenings. What are some of those, Jacqueline?
To your point, he was only on the job for about 8 months before the pandemic hit. And so he was really just starting to ramp up. He didn't even get through his first full legislative session. The legislature was in session for 1 month before it had to abruptly close. But he did offer a preview of sort of what his priorities were during that short tenure pre-pandemic. he's a big advocate for closing the achievement gap. And also, his report on the achievement gap, they did work for a good 3-4 years to figure out what are some of the solutions. And they were very strategic that we're not going to go with the educational fads of the day. Let's look at what's driving the achievement disparities. And so half of that report was spent on things that are happening outside the schoolhouse that students are showing up with at school that the state could really help address, things like food insecurity, housing insecurity. He's really mindful of not laying all of the ills of poverty on teachers in schools and thinking that there's a silver bullet to sort of fix everything that's wrong in public schools. As far as inside the public schools, he has not really gone with the fads over history as far as teacher evaluations. He did embrace Common Core. As far as what his priorities were as state education commissioner, leading up to this, teacher diversity was a big thing. He wants people to see people like him in leadership. He had early on, when he was deciding what he wanted to be after he got his bilingual education master's, he decided, I'm not going to be a bilingual teacher. It's important that others see Latinos in positions of leadership in a professional role and not just sort of in these buckets that are for bilingual educators to teach other Spanish-speaking students. And so he used his opportunity as a state education commissioner to really ramp up a campaign for other educators to share their stories of sort of how they decided to become a teacher and sort of start this recruitment campaign to really get people into the classroom. Now, there wasn't money attached with helping people with the financial aid, with the FAFSA attached with that necessarily being ramped up. But there were sort of connections to helping them fill out FAFSA forms, filling out all of those. So within the existing network, but scholarships were not expanded to help get more people into teacher roles in the state. Again, 8 months on the job, he didn't get through his first legislative session. So maybe that would have changed.
The response to his selection as Biden's nominee has been, I think the way I would characterize it is pretty benign. I mean, especially given the controversy that followed Betsy DeVos's selection back in 2017. Adria, what do we know about some of Cardona's biggest supporters? Who are they?
The number one issue that we've seen him judged by, again, is reopening. And over the last few months, we've seen parents have voiced that they've been happy with the state being able to leave it up to districts whether, the schools are opening or remaining closed, and them having that option to send kids back to school. So that's during his time as commissioner, who I've seen, voice that they've been happy with having that option and that being left up to these districts.
Who would you say are his biggest critics?
On the other side of that, parents with disabilities have been frustrated that, there isn't a universal mandate for schools to remain open for their kids. We've seen teacher unions who don't agree, like I mentioned before, who don't agree with schools being open at all because teachers are worried about contracting COVID. And there have also been some parents who don't agree with the mask mandates.
We're talking with Connecticut Mirror reporters Adria Watson and Jacqueline Rabe-Thomas about Miguel Cardona, Joe Biden's pick for Secretary of Education. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Jacqueline, this sounds like a career educator who is stepping into a very political job. How would you describe his approach to navigating those waters at the city and state level? What should we be watching from him in how he approaches the political side of the job?
So he very much has walked a tightrope with reopening schools, but he has never been accused of not returning a phone call that I've heard. He's seen as a collaborator. However much people disagree with his opinion, he hears them out. He also has drawn some concern from folks for not sort of taking bolder stances on issues like reopening schools for those with disabilities who can't learn from home because it's just not possible. But he also has been able to figure out how to have the unions feel a little bit safer with having their kids in school or not be much more vocal than they have been. On the day that it was announced that he would become President-elect's nominee, the unions issued a release saying they were supportive of him being put in that position. He hasn't been so polarizing to not have people really embrace him as a person. And I think that's, the making of a good politician is people like you personally, and they feel heard with him. And so I think he knows how to navigate the tightrope. But again, I think that has also frustrated some about his sort of lack of bold action on things.
School choice was a central plank for the Trump administration and certainly in Betsy DeVos's policy platform. Where does Commissioner Cardona come down on things like charter schools and vouchers?
During his confirmation hearing, he said he'd rather focus on neighborhood schools, not necessarily that he doesn't want to continue supporting the existing charter schools that exist in the state of Connecticut, but rather he thinks it's time to focus on the neighborhood schools in communities. The district where he spent his tenure and he grew up in, there's one choice school, which was already open long before he became one of the top administrators in town. And so his district, if you are to look at where he came from, did not expand school choice. That wasn't a model that his district embraced while he was one of the leaders there. At the state level, charter schools have to come before the State Board of Education, and his State Department of Education will make recommendations whether or not they should be approved or denied or put on probation. And he has put a few charter schools on probation, but not noticeably at a higher rate than his predecessors have. So again, he's not polarizing on the issue. And, charter school advocates will say, I don't see him as a friend or foe. He's sort of middle of the line. He has allowed charter schools to grow as far as in Connecticut, as charter schools open, they kind of phase in with grades. So, the first year they'll have a kindergarten, the next year they'll have a kindergarten and first grade. And so he has allowed that natural growth to happen during his tenure. But I don't think that's controversial in Connecticut to allow schools that the state promised to open and granted their charter, and state legislators voted to adopt their initial funding that he would allow something like that to happen. As far as magnet schools go, there is a school desegregation case here in Connecticut that has been going on since 1996. And he was one of the key players that helped negotiate the expansion of participation in magnet school seats. So existing magnet schools that were already open, allowing them to also increase the number of seats they fill in those schools, as well as there's a program called Open Choice that allows city kids from Hartford to attend some of the inner ring suburban districts that have some capacity and decide to allow those students to attend. So he did also set aside funding for that program as well.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because they don't get talked about as much in national conversations about school choice, but magnet programs are about choice, and they're a huge part of the Connecticut education sphere. Then I encourage our listeners to go to Connecticut Mirror and read some of Jacqueline's past coverage of that lawsuit. It's fascinating.
Well, thanks for the the prop on that.
Well, I'm a little bit of an education geek on that type of thing, but I do think that magnets should be part of this conversation.
Yeah, I think magnet schools are more appealing to individuals. In Connecticut, I think it's because money doesn't necessarily get taken away from the local school, so they're not as political there. They are more expensive because then you are building new buildings, you are paying for students to attend multiple schools. So it is more costly, the magnet school approach here in Connecticut. But again, you're talking about schools where in Hartford, people can make the point that have been underfunded for a very long time, and that those schools spend much less than some of their surrounding suburbs as well.
Adria, you've been looking into Miguel Cardona's tenure in Meriden, where he was an assistant superintendent before taking the education commissioner job. It's also his hometown and where he spent the bulk of his professional career. What did you learn?
I learned that he worked closely with the superintendent there for, increasing participation in advanced placement and early college experience courses. They worked together also on, reducing suspension. And one of the things that they did was start looking at suspensions as something that's exclusionary and not benefiting students, and also using data to track things like student behavior in order for them to have discussions about what it told them and what they could do differently in order to help students.
What did you find out about how effective he was there? Were there particular policies or procedures he put in place that have stayed on even after he left?
One of the things that I saw specifically with the the student participation in advanced placement classes, that over the last 10 years, they've gone from having in 2010 and 2011 school year, having 184 students participate to 978. And Jackie, do you want to talk a bit more about if I'm missing anything?
Sure. So he is very much a data focused person. So he looks at the outcomes, but not necessarily for accountability purposes, all the reason, but just to sort of make sure that programs are in fact working. And so one of the things that Adria and I looked at was, okay, so what are their growth metrics in the district of some of their standardized testing? Long has there been a history of looking at a single point in time to see where students are in that district on testing. But Connecticut actually, not under Miguel's leadership, but under the previous administration, they started looking at growth and how much tracking students from how much they grow from one year to the next. And Meriden is a district that's one of the lowest performing in the state, among the 33 lowest performing in the state. But it also, when you break it out by how much students are actually growing each year from year to year and catching up with their peers and reaching grade level, they're actually ahead of the pack compared to some of the other districts in the state as far as that forward momentum and forward trajectory to make sure that students are, in fact, on pace to catch up back to grade level within 5 years. 2/3 of students are on track in that district during his tenure. And so I think that kind of speaks to sort of the holistic, all these approaches with increased advanced placement participation, as well as various other, extended school time, all of that. On the advanced placement, Cardona regularly talks about sort of the failure of low expectations. And that's why he embraced Common Core. That's why he embraced access to higher level classes for people who otherwise would be shut out of those programs. And just from his own personal experience, he felt like he was sort of tracked into a certain level. You go to automotive school, you go to work in a shop, and he became the first in his family to go to college. And so when you look at sort of that tracking and you look at sort of the improvement of some of those programs, you start to see real measurable outcomes that, 2/3 of the students in that district were on pace under his leadership to catch up with their peers. And that's a lot better than many other of those lowest performing districts in the state. His district was about on pace with the state average.
President-elect Biden promised to pick a school teacher for his education secretary. Some people said it would have made more sense from a practical standpoint to pick someone with higher education administrative experience, and that's given that the federal student loan program is the biggest ticket item on the education department's portfolio. What do we know about Cardona's position on higher education issues like student loan debt and Title IX?
So he does sit on the state public universities governing body boards, but he has not made any sort of lasting impression for either Adria or myself that we recall. But aside from that, he has worked at the State Department of Ed to help build the pipeline of students who are going into teacher prep programs and making sure that they're more diverse. There's been a long problem in Connecticut and across the country that the teacher prep programs don't reflect the actual demographics of their state. He did testify in Connecticut a couple years ago before becoming the state's education commissioner that he did support requiring that every public high school in Connecticut have to fill out the FAFSA, meaning we're going to make sure that students know they have the potential to go to college and have essentially, a good pot of money to help them pay for it, so that people are making an educated decision about college or community college might be within their price point. He hasn't made any public comments that we are aware of, however, about sort of those overarching higher ed issues.
I think there's going to be some wait and see there. I will say a longtime issue for education reporters nationally has been getting access to people at the Department of Education. I want to make it clear that this was a concern certainly not limited to the Trump administration and was a challenge during the Obama years as well. What's his track record on that front in terms of being responsive to media inquiries?
So I have now covered 5 education commissioners in Connecticut, and I would have to say he is one of the more open commissioners. It's easier for me to get interviews under his tenure. I very much see him as wanting to make sure the story is told and that reporters get access to all the information that they need. He knows we're going to write the story regardless. He also has a habit of reaching out to reporters on our staff. His team does, reaching out to reporters on our staff and saying, hey, Miguel wants to talk about this or this or this. I don't remember previous commissioners saying that or reaching out to reporters to sort of do the rounds. So I think he's going to maybe bring some more transparency. But what do I know? I don't cover the U.S. Department of Education as in depth as I do the local state Department of Ed. As far as getting access to other people and information in his state Department of Ed, it hasn't been a huge obstacle in Connecticut, I've found, but I have found that he has not thrown up any barriers in Connecticut that I'm aware of.
Adria, what's he like in an interview? What's his demeanor, his persona?
I got to talk to him a few months ago to have just an initial kind of interview with him. It was my first time getting to talk to him since becoming an education reporter out here. And he was very upfront about his initiatives and how passionate he was to make sure that at the end of the day, like kids are getting an education and not just an education, but a valuable education. And also during my interview with him, he wanted to make sure that we kept a line of communication and brought up, possibly having discussions like once a month if we needed to, in order to keep that line of communication open and just to like make sure that I have access to him to fact check anything or be able to talk to him about different things that were changing at the time with the Department of Education. And at the time, one of the things that were happening was that they were launching that data system that Jackie talked about earlier. And so that was another big thing. He just wanted to make sure like we understood and that people who were reading our coverage also were able to understand and know why they were doing that.
All right. You two know the deep, dark secrets about this guy. He's an open page now that he's going to be a federal potential cabinet secretary. What do we need to know about him that we don't know?
He was voted in his high school yearbook by his classmates as best looking. And he also did the most for his class. And he is also married to Miss Connecticut.
My goodness. That is quite a CV. So she competed in the Miss America pageant and everything?
Yep. And they married the next year after she was no longer a miss.
Fantastic. Jacqueline, any parting words of advice for the national reporters who are now on the Cardona beat?
He likes talking about his family, and he really appreciates getting to know reporters and their personal stories and seeing what their educational experience is for their kids. And learning from that, you can tell that he really likes knowing people on a personal level and is really comfortable sharing his personal experiences, which I think makes people able to sort of understand his thinking behind things.
Jacqueline Rabe Thomas is the housing and education reporter for the Connecticut Mirror. She is also an EWA reporting fellow. Jacqueline, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to your reporting project, too.
Thanks for having us.
And Adria Watson covers education for the Connecticut Mirror, and she is part of the Report for America Corps. Adria, great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalism and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.